Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, I was really excited about my topic all the way flying here, and every single person, with the exception of one, has already covered this topic throughout the day. So little by little, I've been sitting here trying to decide how I'm going to make this a little bit more interesting, because I think you've already heard a lot about big data. But let me ask you, just to start, how many people in this room know what big data is? Just raise your hands. Okay, maybe then I'll go through some of the more basic parts of this just to give you a little bit of understanding. A little bit about LAX really quickly, and Declan, if you're still here, Declan said that he was in this industry 5 years. Declan, I've only been doing it 8 years. Before I came to LAX, I was the head of IT for the United States National Park Service. So one day I was worrying about Yosemite and Yellowstone and the Statue of Liberty and the Golden Gate Bridge, and the next day I was worried about 72 million passengers coming through the airport and the busiest origination and departure airport in the world. So, big data. I'm going to go through just a little bit of a primer on big data, and then take you into some of the air transport industry and some airport examples, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing at LAX. So, as you've heard numerous times today, the airport industry is extremely quick moving, and you have, again, we have 72 million passengers came through LAX last year. Each of them seems to be on a completely different journey. They all have different needs. How do we anticipate those needs? How do we make our airlines have the best experience they can have as a business? We have a huge concessions program at LAX. How do we keep our concessionaires happy? Big data is one of the reasons that we're able to start thinking about this. So let me just mention a few things. Big data is considered to be the next big thing in the IT world. Anybody know where the term big data was coined? How long ago? Actually, nobody knows. Nobody has actually been able to come up with the first person. There's some speculation that somebody by the name of Massey coined the term in 1999. But big data just started appearing in magazines, and now it's almost taken on a life of its own. Big companies like Google, eBay, LinkedIn, they had a natural repository of data, so they started looking at big data, particularly Google, who not only has just, it has email, it has social media, it has websites, it has search engines. It's almost the perfect example of a big data collector. So just very simply, what is big data? Extremely large data sets that may be analyzed computationally to reveal patterns, trends, and associations, especially related to human behavior and interactions. And I really want to stress human behavior and interactions, because that's the thing that really where big data is becoming important. This is just a quote from CIO from Goldman Sachs. 90% of the world's data has been created in the past 2 years. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data per day. How many of you are overwhelmed with the number of emails, text messages, letters, memos, and other things you get each day? Can you just imagine that multiplied hundreds and millions of times? That's the personal example of big data. So it can be similar to small data in some ways, but also larger in size. But it requires a whole different approach. I was, Declan, really happy to hear you talk about structured data as opposed to non-structured data, which is what big data is. I put on the bottom, it's not your father's data warehouse. For those of you who've had a data warehouse, this is completely different. A data warehouse was the 1990s, 1980s term for pulling together a lot of structured data and analyzing it. Big data goes into a completely different direction. So just a couple of little pieces of information here. Walmart handles more than 1 million customer transactions every hour. Facebook handles 40 billion photos from its user base. The human genome took 10 years to process, now it can be achieved in 1 week. All of these are examples of big data. Okay, here's the difference between, in some ways, between big data and data that you've used in the past. It comes in a lot of varieties. It's structured, it's unstructured, and it's particularly unstructured data that is really the important part of what big data is. You can imagine one text message is data in a big data structure. Velocity, the data speed, is coming in extremely fast. You heard the gentleman from Delhi Airport talk about the Internet of Everything. The velocity of all that information coming in at one time is enormous. The volume, it's coming in, it's so much data that it's almost traditional data processing methods really can't handle data, big data. And finally, veracity. The data accuracy is very important. And you have to be able to not only bring in data, but have some assurance that it's actually correct. Again, I'm going to go through this very quickly because I think you've heard a lot about big data, and I want to get to some airport examples. But examples of volume, a typical PC in the year 2000 had 10 gigabytes of storage. Now it has 4 terabytes. I'll just give you an example, and I'll just skip through this. We have 3,000 CCTV cameras at LAX. We have storage for 35 petabytes of data. They say that if you took every written word ever produced since the beginning of time in every language, you could put that into 56 petabytes of data. So we have just half of that, a little bit more than half of that, just on camera images alone at LAX. Talk about velocity. Clickstream and ad impressions are capturing user behavior, millions of events per second. High-frequency stock trading algorithms reflect market changes. Variety, it's geospatial data, 3D data, audio and video files, unstructured text, including log files and social media. We all know traditional database systems are designed to address smaller volumes of structured data, fewer updates, and a predictable, consistent data structure. That's not big data. So I just point out here some of the different types: structured, semi-structured, unstructured, and you have a variety of data that comes in every time from real-time to batch data. How is big data different? The gentleman from Delhi talked about the Internet of Everything. It's generated a lot by sensors. So a sensor if you have Wi-Fi tracking people going through an airport, that's big data, tracking that information as it goes through. And just a couple of other things that we're actually starting to look at LAX right now. Big data coming from mobile devices, microphones, readers and scanners. We're looking at our badge scanners to provide us data. Science facilities program, software, social media, and cameras. Just going to break off a little bit here. As probably many of you know, we had a shooting at LAX in 2012. Somebody shot a TSA agent. We had, within 2 hours of that shooting, over 1 million tweets on Twitter about the shooting at LAX. Some of them, because Los Angeles, the media capital of the world, on a lot of the airplanes that were hung up in LAX, we had movie stars and singers who were tweeting about what was going on. Now, we lost an incredible source of information at that time that we're now looking into purchasing software to analyze tweets so that we can be on top of the data that's being generated about what's going on at the airport. Interestingly, during that period of time, within 4 minutes, the shooter himself was shot. The airport, that terminal was closed down the remainder of the day. The airport was disrupted for about 4 or 5 hours. But there were more social media generated on that one day than we had at the airport in probably the previous 2 years. So, big data analytics, examining large amount of data, appropriate information, looking for hidden patterns and unknown correlations, competitive advantage to your business. There's 2 or 3 companies here, and I'm not going to do a commercial for the companies that are here, but I've been in IT about 20 years. Most of the staff that I've ever had would not be the type of staff members who could process this kind of data. I would look to companies, and I'll mention their name. There's a couple out here, Boxever and a couple who are out here. I don't know them at all. I've never used them, but I'm going to get to know them after I leave here. You need to find a company who can do this kind of work for you. It's not traditional processing. It's not traditional data processing. So this is some of the areas, and I'm going to switch into the airport industry in a second, but you'll see a lot of it in Homeland Security, traffic control, manufacturing, telecom, trading analytics. They're starting to get into big data. Very quickly, there's a lot of risks in big data too. Privacy, data that you have to look at. Just using the data properly, very important. Okay, so this is a slide I just added at lunchtime because I want to outline as we go forward into the airport business what really are the issues with big data. You hear a lot of technical people, and again, some of the folks out there will tell you how to use big data, how to analyze it. I think the biggest issue with big data is having at your organization managers and decision makers who think broadly enough to ask those questions. I was looking at, again, I'm going to talk about Boxever. They have a study that they say 50% of respondents say their management understands the implications of big data. Well, I can't wait to look at that study because I know for certain 50% of the managers in my airport don't think at all about big data. And I'm not even sure that they can think about the questions that big data can answer. So let me just get a show of hands again. How many of you in here feel that the management of your organization really understands what big data is and can ask far-reaching questions that have never been asked before? I'm just curious, how many people think that? Okay, well, that's my experience too. This is one of the challenges of big data. Finding the kind of manager who can use that information. Collecting and amassing data that previously has not been collected together. This is a challenge. And it's something that big organizations like Google, who actually, it's their data, can do. But if you have to pull it from a lot of sources, as I'll talk about in the airport business, it's tough. Having an IT staff that can pull the data together in a meaningful format, I've already explained to you, I don't think that most IT traditional legacy staff can really work on this. If you're going to get into big data, you really need to get a third-party vendor who really understands analytics. And you know what? They have to think in an unstructured manner, much the way the data is. And finally, presenting the information in a manner that those same managers and decision makers, who you weren't even sure could ask the questions to begin with, can understand what you've given to them. This is what I think is the real essence of big data. So let's talk about it in the air transport industry. Again, a lot of this has been covered today, so I'm going to go through it quick, and I think we're a little bit behind time, so I'm going to try to help catch up here. Airports, airlines, concessionaires, airport support businesses, travel agencies, all collect and maintain an enormous amount of data. What is the one identifying factor of all of those entities? They don't share data with each other. You're not going to get United Airlines to share data with American Airlines. You're not going to get Westfield as a concessionaire to share data with Hudson. It's not going to happen. So, major challenge in big data in our business. Pulling it all together into all of the siloed information, turning it into meaningful and useful data, it's a challenge. Some of the big data possibilities in our industry. 35 million flights depart annually. Each of those resulted from a ticket. Each of those tickets was purchased in a certain way. Knowing how those tickets were purchased, knowing how the consumer looked to find that information would provide tremendous information to an airline or Expedia or anybody, or travel agent. But nobody wants to share that information. 3 billion passengers go through our airports a year. Think about all the usable data. Journeying to the airport, taxis, mass transit, traffic sensors in the roads, parking operations, dining and shopping experiences, flight plans, seat selection, baggage checking, dwell times in the airport, social media interactions, cell phone and mobile device interactions. If you had all that information, your contact center would really be good. But who's going to pull that together? Well, a few people have started. So this is, I don't want you to think that this is fruitless, but you have to pick a dish and you have to work on it and you have to start slow. So I'm going to talk about 3 airports. One, Sydney Airport, 37 million passengers, 300,000 flights. They wanted to find out more information about their passengers and their passenger flow through the airport. They're lucky in Sydney because they have a fairly large carrier in Qantas who dominates a lot of their data. So once they could get Qantas to provide information, they were able to collect data and use a predictive and analytical tool. They use a tool that has been around for 35 years, which has been updated considerably, called IBM's Statistical Package for the Social Sciences, SPSS, if you've ever heard of that. If they produced information which improved the customer experience in a lot of airport areas, parking, passenger lounge access, and targeting of specific products in duty-free shops. So they took data from a very centralized source, and they were able to turn it into just 3 major pieces of data. Gatwick Airport has just jumped into big data. They have a tremendous CIO there by the name of Michael Ibbotson. I've worked with him in a couple of cases. They're a very busy airport. Even though you hear more about Heathrow, Gatwick has an enormous number of connecting flights every day. What they found out was that their customers, oftentimes, to get a cheaper fare, would actually buy 2 tickets. They would buy a ticket to go one place, connect in Gatwick, and then buy a second ticket. Because what they were finding was that their customers felt that a full-through ticket going through Gatwick cost more as a whole than just buying 2 tickets. So what they've been doing is they've been asking their passengers, working on what their passengers' flight plan data is, and they've actually they're starting to develop an app which will allow passengers to purchase 2 separate tickets on 2 separate airlines, making their connection through Gatwick. Something very different in our business. So they went through search data to determine how people were going about booking these flights. They showed that many of these self-connected routes weren't covered by what people were searching for, thus leaving a gaping hole in the market. So they're creating a whole new program called Gatwick Connect. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about LAX. I've just been told to wrap up, but I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about what we're doing now at LAX, and I can tell you we're just starting here. Okay, we're looking for an external third party to help us put our data together. We have a lot of information. We've just invested. We're different. We did not go to the cloud. I like to have all the information stored locally. I have a lot of proprietary data. I have a lot of law enforcement data. We have our own police force. I couldn't convince our police department to let me put things in the cloud. So we're starting to pull together a lot of information on mobile devices right now. We are implementing mobile devices. We're collecting information on terminals, airfield, and landside, and GIS data all at the same time. We take our information from pass-serve, we mix that in with our AODB, our CETA AODB, and we're starting to generate some gate management information. We're managing that with our mixing that with our sales information from Westfield, who's our LAX terminal concession manager. We're starting to learn some things about our passengers. The first thing we learned, ladies in this room, if we have an airplane full of Asian women, we would like to build a boarding gate at Louis Vuitton. So we now put all of our Chinese airlines right next to our most premier duty-free and shops, because we can actually see the difference between how sales data with certain airlines as opposed to other airlines. We're modifying our building systems to match our flight data. Again, we're really trying to look at data so that we can cut down on cost of utilities. Very interesting. We have over 4,000 doors that are access controlled at our airport. Believe it or not, we have about 300 alarms go off a day, which require a policeman to be responding to. We're now starting to manage that data and tying it into our airport police personnel scheduling so that we have people in the right places where those same doors are going off, because if they're not really people running on the airfield, most of the time it's just people leaning against the door. So we're starting to work that into our police schedule. Adding signage to those doors that are routinely breached. We're just starting to look at, in LA we have a lot of signals in our road systems. We're starting to match that with some of our parking data. So we're just beginning, but those are some of the things we're looking at doing. So we already talked about a little bit about airlines. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Airlines are beginning to realize the benefits of big data for aircraft safety and maintenance. The gentleman from Hewlett-Packard mentioned that earlier today. He was spot on. Data from onboard sensors provides airline maintenance crews. You've already heard this today. I'm not going to repeat it. Our challenges, traditionally, our industry does not work together. New social media big data sources are emerging with non-traditional data. Capturing that data requires a special data processing techniques. Every industry, people are seeking competitive advantage against each other. Trying to get the data you need to do big data analytics is going to be a challenge. The amount of information is staggering, and most airports have very small IT departments, as do smaller airlines. You heard Declan mention, started with 1, now he has 70. So let me just give you some do's and don'ts in the big data world. This is my wrap up. Do enrich your big data to gain context about your customer. It's all about the customer. And the customer is doing things on the web, on Twitter, on social media. You're not going to collect as much information in the traditional sources as you will on how much time they spend on your website. Do use big data to focus on the entire customer journey, not just specific parts. Track customers at each stage because that's how you get the full benefit. But don't forget that there are small, meaningful customer interactions that you can use. So, what are purchasing patterns? You saw Sydney only looked at 3 small, discrete pieces. And finally, make the correct privacy choices because there's a lot of data, and the last thing you want to do is alienate your customers by utilizing their data in a way that's not appropriate. And finally, on the do's, you have to operate your business differently. Big data is going to give you information that you never thought about using before, so you have to use it differently. Just 3 don'ts. Don't focus solely on collecting big data at the expense of quality. Just getting a lot of data into a database that is not useful and is not qualitative is going to do you no good whatsoever. Don't forget your IT department. You're going to have to invest in a different type of person because the traditional legacy IT personnel are not really in tune to using this kind of data. And finally, when you take on a big data initiative, it almost sounds contradictory. Start small with big data because it can bury you quickly. Thank you.